All right, everyone, this is a follow-up lesson from the previous lesson where we talked about compound sentences. So in that previous lesson, we learned a few things about compound sentences that we are going to use to help broaden our horizons about sentence structure, and then we are going to further that concept a little bit today and talk about complex sentences. But just to kind of get our brains warmed up and get us back into the sentence structure mode, I have a couple of questions for you, which I put up here on the screen. So whenever we talked about compound sentences, then we discussed the fact that compound sentences consist of two clauses. What kind of clauses make up a compound sentence? Can you either unmute yourself or just type it in the chat? A compound sentence consists of two blank clauses. What kind of clauses? Okay, so I'm getting a couple answers. So the answer here is independent. So a compound sentence consists of two independent clauses. Absolutely. Good job. Okay, so we also discussed some different ways to create a compound sentence. So we know a compound sentence consists of these two independent clauses, but we talked about how you can't just throw them together. You have to conjoin them or combine them in a specific way in order for it to be grammatically correct. So how many different ways did we discuss yesterday about how we can combine two independent clauses to create a compound sentence? 3. That's absolutely right. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Absolutely right. So we discussed that a compound sentence consists of two independent clauses, and then we discussed 3 different ways how you can combine the two independent clauses in order to make the compound sentence. So these 3 different ways that we used or that we talked about, I would like to challenge you right now to come up with your own compound sentence. Okay, so I know this might take a little bit of time and effort. This is something that I had warned you about previously that I was going to ask you to do. So I'm going to challenge you right now to think about those 3 different ways that we discussed and see if you can come up with your own compound sentence using 1, 2, or all 3 of those, and provide me an example in the chat, please. Okay, I'm starting to see some examples come in. Gonna see. So I go to the, okay, so let's see this one. So I'm going to see if I can do this. Tony got up late today, which is an independent clause. He was late to class. So we've got Tony got up late today, which is an independent clause. Then we have he was late to class, which is also an independent clause. So that's great. We've got two independent clauses here that you're trying to combine together. And this is one of the fanboys, right? So for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Those words, those fanboys, are words that you can use to create compound sentences. However, there's one thing that's missing with this example that I have up on the screen. Does anybody have an idea of what it is? Yes, good job, good job, good job. So, yes, exactly. So what this sentence was missing was this, comma, coordinating conjunction. So it was good, except for you just missed that comma. So that's something to keep in mind when you're creating compound sentences. That comma and the coordinating conjunction, they're a package deal. So you have to have them both. If you just have the comma, then that creates a problem that's called a comma splice, and it's no good. If you just have the coordinating conjunction, then that creates a problem that is called a run-on sentence. Again, no good. So this example was great initially, but then we worked together to fix it by adding the comma along with the coordinating conjunction. So awesome, awesome job. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of other examples that I found that you guys created. Check this one out. I really need to go to work, but I'm too sick to drive. Okay, well, let's break this down. So like I told you yesterday, what I always recommend doing is identifying the conjunction point, identifying the point where they are brought together. So I see here I've got a fanboy and but, and then I've got the comma. So we've got the comma and the coordinating conjunction, and they are used correctly. So now I'm going to look on each side and make sure that I'm dealing with an independent clause. So I really need to go to work. Yep, that could stand alone. I am too sick to drive. Yep, that could stand alone. We got a capital letter at the beginning. We got a period at the end. We have a comma along with the coordinating conjunction, joining the two together. Excellent. This is a perfect example. Very, very, very good job. There's another one I wanted to show you. A couple more that I wanted to show you, actually. You guys did an awesome job generating these examples. Super impressed. Okay, let's look at this one. I like coffee, but I don't like tea. What do you guys think? I feel like if I'm looking at this, then I can see an independent clause in I like coffee. Good job. I see an independent clause in I like tea, but then I'm getting this feedback in the chat. It's missing a comma. Exactly, exactly, exactly. So you put a comma right here in front of the coordinating conjunction. So this, I like coffee, but I don't like tea, with the comma and the coordinating conjunction, capital letter at the beginning, punctuation mark at the end. Perfect. This is an excellent example of a compound sentence. Very, very, very good job. There was one more that I wanted to show you. Oh, it's over here. Okay, so I go to the park, semicolon, I take my dog. What do you guys think? Is this good? Yes, this is absolutely so far the examples that you had generated, then they all were using the method of the comma and the coordinating conjunction, which is completely in bounds and great job. But we did say that we talked about 3 different methods, correct? So here is one of the other methods that we talked about where you can take 2 independent clauses and join them together with just a semicolon in the middle. And that's perfectly acceptable. So really, really, really good job on that. Proud of y'all. So here we're just in review. Here were the 3 different ways that we talked about that you can create a compound sentence. They were the comma plus the coordinating conjunction, which we just gave several examples of. The semicolon in the middle of the 2 independent clauses, which we just gave one example of. And then we also talked about this third option where you kind of combine the 2 and you use a semicolon plus a conjunctive adverb plus a comma. So here is an example of the comma plus a coordinating conjunction. I really want to earn my HiSET credential, comma, but I have several competing priorities. Absolutely. Switch colors. Number 2 example right here. When you just put a semicolon in the middle, I am committed to completing my goal. I will do whatever it takes to earn my HiSET credential. Again, if you look at this conjunction point, the point where you join them together, you bring them together, and you look on each side, you see that you have independent clauses. And you know that these are the rules that you can use to join those independent clauses, and they're used correctly. So you can definitely just throw a semicolon in between the 2 independent clauses, and you're good to go. Lastly, number 3 is an example of kind of a more complicated way of putting them together, which is to use a semicolon, a conjunctive adverb, and a comma. And it would look something like this. I get overwhelmed with everything I have to do. However, I believe in myself and know that I am capable to achieve anything I put my mind to. Probably I might, if I was revising this sentence, make this, I believe in myself and know that I am capable of achieving. So this 2 should be of, just proofreader in me. Okay, so any questions about any of these methods for creating a compound sentence? If so, please go ahead and raise your hand and I'll be happy to address them before moving on. Okay, as always, if you do come up with some questions, then just drop them in the chat or raise your hand and I'm happy to stop. But for now, I would like to move on and talk about a different type of sentence, which is called a complex sentence. So we know that a compound sentence consists of 2 independent clauses, right? A complex sentence has an independent clause plus a dependent clause. Now, you'll remember back whenever we were talking about sentence basics and we talked about this idea of a fragment. So we talked about everything that a sentence needs in order to be complete. Then we also looked at examples that weren't complete sentences. And I said, now remember what this looks like, because really a fragment or an incomplete sentence is kind of the equivalent of a dependent clause, all right? So if an independent clause has all of the makings of a complete sentence, then a dependent clause has all the makings of a fragment. Let's look at some examples here. Here are some examples of dependent clauses. Because my alarm didn't go off. Well, we know that that's not complete, right? What happened as a result of your alarm not going off? We need more information. So this couldn't stand alone by itself. It would need additional information in order for it to make sense. This is a dependent clause. Or if it was literally just standing by itself, then it would be called a fragment. Sometimes folks try to punctuate dependent clauses, and that makes them fragments. Let's look at this next example. Since you missed your flight today. Okay, so we know that we need more information there, right? Since you missed your flight today, what? Well, since we don't know, then we know that this is not complete. Again, this is an example of a dependent clause. Here are some other examples. Although I would love to join you, what? We need more, right? Whenever I visit my parents on Sunday, what happens when you visit your parents on Sunday? After I went to the concert, then what? Like, I need to know more. This can't just stand alone by itself. These aren't expressing complete thoughts. I need to know more. Once she returned her clothes to the store, again, what happened once she returned her clothes to the store? So since these groups of words aren't expressing complete thoughts, we call them dependent clauses. So a dependent clause needs an independent clause in order for it to make a complete sentence. It can't stand alone by itself. Found another, I should say, needs. Dependent clauses. Oh, no, never mind. It doesn't. I forgot. Dependent clauses need an independent clause in order for them to have what it takes to be a complete sentence. Exactly. Yes. So if we look at these examples we have up here on the screen, because my alarm didn't go off, I was late for work. Well, because my alarm didn't go off is dependent. I was late for work is independent. So this independent clause was just what this dependent clause needed in order for it to make sense. Let's look at another example. Since you missed your flight today, I will take you to the airport. Well, since you missed your flight today is dependent, right? We need to know more. But I will take you to the airport tomorrow, that is independent, right? So this, since you missed your flight today, needed this, I will take you to the airport tomorrow, in order for it to be complete, in order for it to make sense. So this is called a complex sentence when it has a dependent clause and an independent clause. In a sentence, if you have a dependent clause, then you need an independent clause in order to give it the structure it needs to express a complete thought and be considered a complete sentence. So let's look at some more examples. I want you to see if you can identify the dependent clause and the independent clause in the following examples. So we'll go through them, and then you can either unmute yourself, or if you just want to toss it in the chat, that's fine too. But what I want you to do is see if you can identify which part of the sentence is a dependent clause and which part of the sentence is an independent clause. So we're going to look at number 1. Although I would love to join you, I am unable to go to the concert. I'd like to hear from you here. In number 1, what do you think is the dependent clause, and what do you think is the independent clause? Yes.
I think although I would like to join you is independent, and I am. Can you hear me?
I can. Yep.
Both of them are independent.
So you think the first part is dependent and the second part is independent?
Yes.
Good. Absolutely. Teen, you got that too. Very good job. Okay. So although I would love to join you, that is dependent, right? That can't stand alone by itself. I need to know more. I am unable to go to the concert. Now that could stand alone by itself. If we didn't have any of this other stuff, in the sentence, then you could just say, I am unable to go to the concert. And that would make sense, right? So we are going to combine these two in order to make a larger sentence, and it's called a complex sentence when you have a dependent clause and an independent clause. But this first dependent clause, it needed the second part, this independent clause, to lean on to give it the structure it needs in order to make an actual sentence. You guys did an amazing job on that. Thank you. Good job. Okay, so let's look. Yes, absolutely. Good job, good job. Let's look at this second part, or let's look at number 2. Whenever I visit my parents on Sunday, I am always tired on Monday morning. So what do you think here? Which part do you think is independent and which part do you think is dependent? Yes, go ahead.
Uh, the first one is dependent, and I am always tired in the morning is independent.
Great job. Absolutely. So whenever I visit my parents on Sunday, that is, I need to know more, right? Well, what happens? I'm always tired on Monday. Well, that could stand alone by itself. So that is an independent clause. I am always tired on Monday is independent. Whenever I visit my parents on Sunday is dependent. And you combine the two in order to make a complete sentence. Great job. You guys are really picking up on this. So after I went to the concert, I stopped by the store on my way home. Anybody want to unmute yourself, or else just put in the chat if you want to? The first part is dependent, the second part is independent. Absolutely. After I went to the concert, that can't stand alone by itself. We need to know more, but I stopped by the store on my way home. That could stand alone by itself. So this independent clause, I stopped by the store on my way home, really gives the first part, which is dependent, the structure it needs in order to make a complete sentence. You are doing very, very well. Let's look at one more example here. Once she returned her clothes to the store, Sue felt confident about purchasing a new dishwasher. Any ideas here? First part dependent. Sure, go ahead if you want. Yep, go ahead.
Once she returned her clothes to the store, this is dependent. So
Yes.
feel confident about purchasing a new dishwasher. This is independent.
You are absolutely right. Very good job. Thank you. Perfect. So I think you guys have a good idea here. Now, I will just kind of point out here that you have been identifying in all of these sentences, you've been identifying them as first part and second part, first part and second part. So keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to that idea of what makes one, how did you identify that one part was the first part and one part was the second part? I'm guessing that you were talking about in each of these cases, you identified that comma and made that the first part and identified that as the second part. So just keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that later, and you all did a great job identifying that. Okay, so subordinating conjunctions. Now, we talked about coordinating conjunctions yesterday, right? Fanboys. Fanboys are coordinating conjunctions. So coordinating conjunctions, for, and, nor, but, or, yes. So those are the fanboys. Those are coordinating conjunctions. Those are words that you use along with a comma to put two independent clauses together in order to create a compound sentence, right? So today we're going to talk a little bit about subordinating conjunctions. So subordinating conjunctions are also words. Unfortunately, they don't have a fun little acronym like fanboys, but so you have to look at the function that they have in the sentence in order to identify if it's the word that is acting as a subordinating conjunction or not. But so subordinating conjunctions are words that are added to a clause that make them independent. So let's look at some of these examples that we have been talking about. Look at this first example. Because my alarm didn't go off. Well, we've already decided that that's an independent clause, right? We need to know more. What happened because your alarm didn't go off? Well, look at this one right after it. My alarm didn't go off. Now that is independent, correct? That expresses a complete thought. That has all that it needs in order to be a complete sentence. So if I look at the difference between these two things, what do you see as the main difference between the two of them? Because, absolutely, that's exactly right. So the difference is the word because. The only difference between the first one, the only difference between this and this is literally just the word because. This is the only thing that separates one from being dependent from the other that is independent. Just that word because. Because is a subordinating conjunction. Because is a word that was added to the clause that took it from being independent and made it dependent. Okay, so let's look at some more examples of this. So what I want you to do now is to see if you can look at these examples that we talked about earlier, but look at them in a little bit of a different light now, considering that you know what a subordinating conjunction is. So if I look at this number 1 and I say, since you missed your flight today, can you either unmute yourself or just drop it in the chat and tell me, what do you think is the subordinating conjunction in that sentence? Since. Absolutely. Good job. Yes. 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 Perfect. The word since makes number 1 a dependent clause. If I didn't have the word since here, if I took that off and I made this a capital Y and I put a period back here, this would say, you missed your flight today. And that would be independent, right? That can stand alone by itself. I added one word. I added the word since, and that changed everything, right? That took this clause from being independent and made it dependent. Number 2, what do you think the subordinating conjunction is? Yes. Good answer.
I think although.
You are absolutely right. Good job. So again, let's kind of dissect this sentence a little bit, or this clause like we did the last one. If I just took out the word although, I would be left with, I would love to join you. Put an exclamation mark at the end here. That's my exclamation mark. I would love to join you. That could stand alone by itself, right? But one word, although, I added although, and that took this dependent clause or this independent clause and made it dependent. Number 3, what do you think is the coordinating conjunction in number 3? Yep, I have one correct answer so far. Whenever I visit my parents on Sunday.
Whatever.
Yes, absolutely. Good job, good job, good job. So again, if I break this down a little bit, I'm going to take out this word whenever. I visit my parents on Sunday. Cool. Hope you guys have a good time, right? Like that could stand alone by itself. I don't need to know anything else. But I added this word whenever, and that made this clause dependent all of a sudden. So if you think about a conjunction, so we're talking about subordinating conjunctions right now. We talked about coordinating conjunctions yesterday. If you think about a conjunction as being something that brings two things together, then obviously with like the fanboys that we were talking about yesterday, that's a little bit more obvious and even visual to see how these words conjoin. They act as a conjunction. They bring together these two things. It's literally right in the middle of them, right? But so if you want to take that thought a little bit further and think about subordinating conjunctions, we know that a dependent clause needs an independent clause in order for it to make sense, right? In order for it to give it the structure that it needs to make a complete sentence. We know that complex sentences consist of a dependent clause and an independent clause. Well, if you didn't have this word here, then this wouldn't be a dependent clause, and it wouldn't need an independent clause in order to help give it structure. So really, by adding this word, making this clause dependent, that's what's joining it. That's how it's conjoining it to the independent clause. So that's how it's bringing it together. Because if you didn't need that, if you didn't have that word, then you wouldn't need anything to join it to in order for it to make sense. Let's look at number 4. After I went to the concert, what do you think is the subordinating conjunction there? After. Very good. If I take after out and just say I went to the concert, that makes sense, right? And finally, if we look at our last example, number 5, once she returned her clothes to the store, what do you think? Good. Anyone else want to try a shot at? What do you think the subordinating conjunction is for number 5?
Once.
Once. Very good. If you take once out, then if you take once out of the equation, you're making this a capital S on she. Put a punctuation mark at the end. She returned her clothes to the store. That can stand alone by itself. Okay, so any questions at this point? All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on. As always, if you do have questions, please stop me. I want to make sure that you have a great understanding of everything I'm presenting to you, and I don't want to move on if you aren't understanding where we're at, because then you won't be able to build a solid foundation. So here's kind of how it looks like broken down. The highlighted word or the bolded word is the subordinating conjunction, and kind of gives you a little bit of a visual about what it would look like if you could just kind of take those out of the picture. You can see that you would have an independent clause or a complete sentence if you punctuated it correctly. So here is another visual for you to demonstrate kind of the difference between a compound sentence and a complex sentence. So a complex sentence is going to have a dependent clause and an independent clause. A capital letter at the beginning, punctuation mark at the end. A compound sentence is going to have 2 independent clauses. Again, capital letter at the beginning, period at the end, but they're joined together in a specific way, which is what we talked about in our previous lesson. Any questions coming up now? Okay. So here's our 2 types of sentences, an example of each. That's not to say that these are the only two types of sentences there are. These are the only two types that we've talked about. So we've got a compound sentence, which is an independent clause and an independent clause. An example would be, I like peanut butter and jelly, but my dad is allergic to peanut butter. And then we have complex sentences, which are dependent clause plus independent clause. So after I went to the concert, I stopped by the store on my way home. Here is my question for you. Riddle me this. Do they have to be in this order? Something to think about, right? So let's talk about it a little bit. With the compound sentence, you have two independent clauses. So they don't necessarily need each other in order to make sense. So they could just stand alone. So for a compound sentence, it's really probably going to depend on the nature of the relationship between the two clauses. So I could see how if there's a causal relationship, like if this caused this, then it would probably make a difference what order you put the independent clauses in. And certainly I can see how if you are using the method where you use the semicolon conjunctive adverb comma in order to bring them together, then that whatever conjunctive adverb that you use, that word is generally giving an idea of the relationship between the two. So I can see in that case where it would probably matter what the order was. But in some cases, it really doesn't. Like, let's look at this example. I like peanut butter and jelly, but my dad is allergic to peanut butter, right? So that's our first example up here at the top. Well, we know that I like peanut butter and jelly is our first independent clause. We know my dad is allergic to peanut butter is our second independent clause. Well, let's flip them around, right? What would it look like? It would look like this. My dad is allergic to peanut butter, but I like peanut butter and jelly. See, that still makes sense. So the order in which you put them, as far as a compound sentence goes, they could in several cases be switched around. Well, what about a complex sentence? So far, when we've been looking at complex sentences, we've been looking at the dependent clause, then the independent clause, right? We have some more examples here that we looked at. Let's see. There we go. So in all of these, we talked about. Take a second to review these ones that we went over. Everything that we've talked about so far has been dependent clause, independent clause. My question to you is, do you think it has to be that way? Do you think that the dependent clause always has to come at the beginning? Well, let's look at it a little bit. Let's take a look at one of our examples. So let's try it out. Here's our example. After I went to the concert, I stopped by the store on my way home. So this was the example that we looked at that had the dependent clause at the beginning and the independent clause at the end. Well, let's get wild and try to switch the order around and see what happens. Let's put the independent clause at the beginning and the dependent clause at the end. I stopped by the store on my way home after I went to the concert. Does it work? Yes, it does work. That's fine. Good, exactly. Great job recognizing that. You're absolutely right. I stopped by the store on my way home after I went to the concert. That's okay. I kind of like it the first way better. It seems like it flows a little bit better, but there's grammatically nothing wrong with this other than I forgot to put a period at the end of the sentence. That's not the sentence's fault. That's mine. Okay, let's look at some other examples here. Let's look at this first example up here at the top. So we have the dependent clause and the beginning, and then the independent clause. Once she returned her clothes to the store, she felt confident about purchasing a new dishwasher. Okay, now let's flip that around. She felt confident about purchasing a new dishwasher once she returned her clothes to the store. Do you think it works? She felt confident about purchasing a new dishwasher once she returned her clothes to the store. Marie Josie, you like it?
It seems funny.
Well, that is probably why they have this. They have the option of interchanging the two, which what you said brings up a good as a good segue to our next one. But the answer is yes, it does work. I understand what she's saying, and that it seems a little bit clunky, and it just doesn't like flow all that well. So that's, in that case, if you were writing, you'd probably want to switch it around and start with the dependent clause. But grammatically speaking, Sue felt confident about purchasing a new dishwasher once she returned her clothes to the store. Works fine. Let's work at this. Let's look at another example here with the red around it in the middle. The first example says, although I would love to join you, I am unable to go to the concert. And then the second example, when we switch them, says, I am unable to go to the concert, although I would love to join you. Now, I almost didn't include this because it's a little bit tricky, but I thought, you know what, let's do it. Let's just go over it together and figure it out. So first of all, do you think that it works okay, or does it not set right with you? Do you think it sounds weird? What do you think?
I don't think it's working.
Okay, what do you think that we should do then to fix it?
I think it should stay the way it was.
Just keep it the way it was?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was looking this over when I was preparing this, and I kind of thought the same thing, like there's just something that's weird about it. And this is what I think is what's weird about it. In this case, if I was correcting, like if somebody had put this in an essay to me or something like that, in this situation, I think that this word although, again, one way to correct it, exactly like what you said, is just flip it the order around. Put that dependent clause at the beginning, put the independent clause at the end, make it keep it a complex sentence in that way. But another way that you could do it is this word although, once you put it in the middle here, it almost starts acting as like a conjunctive adverb, right? So that's why I think it sounds a little bit funny, because I think that in our minds we think of this word the way that this particular sentence flows. Then what I would recommend doing, if you're not looking to keep it a complex sentence, would be to change it into a compound sentence. Put a semicolon here in the middle, or a semicolon here at the end of concert, keep although, and then put a comma. And then if I look on each side of that conjunction point, I am unable to go to the concert is an independent clause. I would love to join you is an independent clause. So it works. So this is just an example of how sometimes you just got to work with what you know and listen to what you think flows better. And yeah, so in this case, you could really turn this into just a compound sentence, and it might flow a little bit better than flipping the two clauses around. Let's look at this last example. Whenever I visit my parents on Sunday, I am always tired on Monday morning. So that's the case where we had the dependent clause plus the independent clause. The second example where we switched them around, it says, I'm always tired on Monday morning whenever I visit my parents on Sunday. Do you guys think that that works? Yep, I'm getting feedback that says yes, that works, and I would agree. I'm always tired on Monday whenever I visit my parents on Sunday. Again, I think in this case it flows a little bit better. It gives it a little bit more character, but grammatically speaking, there's really nothing wrong with this second one. Again, except for I forgot to put a period, and again, that's not the sentence's fault. It's my own. So let's talk about this idea. Really, I guess that the answer to do they have to be in the dependent clause plus independent clause order? No, the answer is no, it doesn't have to. But the answer is also that sometimes it's better to be that way, which is the nature of writing, right? So now, if you look at these examples a little bit closer, side by side, tell me, so the top one is when we do dependent clause, independent clause. The bottom one is when we do independent clause, dependent clause. Can you tell me, and I'll go back, I'll give you a hint, I'll go back to what I told you to remember from before that you already identified. Tell me what you notice about how each one is punctuated. Do you see a difference between the top example and the bottom example in all of these three cases? Good. Okay, we got one answer come in. That's absolutely right. Remember, I'd like to hear from a couple more people though before I move on and talk about it more. Remember at the beginning when I said that you guys had been identifying the first part versus the second part, and there's really nothing that is labeled. So what made you identify the first part versus the second part? I have one person that picked it up. Okay, there we go. Good. Okay, so the difference between the two is the comma, correct? So in this case, where we have the dependent clause plus the independent clause, we have a comma here. I don't think you can see this gray very well. I'm going to move it to a different color. Okay. Now here down at the second example where we put the independent clause first and then the dependent clause, we didn't use a comma. Case number 2 here, dependent clause, comma, independent clause. Well, whenever we go down to the bottom here, whenever we start with the independent clause and go into the dependent clause, there's no comma. Lastly, dependent clause, independent clause, comma. Whenever we switched it around and said independent clause, dependent clause, we didn't use a comma. So that's the difference. With a complex sentence, if the dependent clause comes first, you need a comma before you go on to the independent clause. You'll see this same comma rule used on a smaller scale too. Essentially, in this case, the dependent clause coming at the beginning of the sentence is acting as an introductory element. So if you put the dependent clause at the beginning, then you need a comma before you go into dependent clause. But if you put the independent clause first, then you don't need the comma before going on. So that is a lot of information that I just threw at you, and you all did amazing. I wonder, does anyone have any questions that you can think of right now, right off the top of your head? Okay, awesome. So what I'll have you work on next is to, if you haven't already, then I would like for you to complete this lesson from Unit 3 on Blackboard. You will watch the videos, you'll review the informational material that is provided, and then the last item is going to be a homework actual exercises where you're going to be working with the subordinating conjunctions and the coordinating conjunctions both. And you'll either just write your answers on a separate sheet of paper, or you can type them up and send them to me. But in either case, the answer key is always provided so you can get that instant feedback. And I would like for you to complete that homework assignment and then send your results to me, and we will discuss them together.